Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 50th anniversary celebration of the opening of the George C. Marshall Library. I'm Jay Adams, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Marshall Foundation. Sadly, I must report that Secretary Jack Marsh regrets he cannot be with us as planned. Yesterday, he was admitted to a hospital following a fall 2 days ago. He remains under observation for a few days. We think he's essentially well, but just recovering from the fall. On Monday, he was honored by the Gerald Ford Foundation, and we know how deeply committed he was to being a part of our event today, and we miss his intellect, grace, and wisdom. It is a distinct honor for the George C. Marshall Foundation to be given the enduring opportunity to celebrate and pass on to future generations the accomplishments of General Marshall. His was a life of singular achievement and equally significant humility. Following a career of public service lasting more than 50 years, he rejected several offers to publish his memoirs and become enriched in the process. As a student of history, he knew his life and times would be studied long after his passing. With General Marshall's approval, President Harry Truman led the effort to create our library to preserve and house Marshall's papers and those of his contemporaries, and to establish it as the place to study the man, his times, and the history of his era, the first half of the 20th century. Thus, the idea for a library was born. The George C. Marshall Research Foundation was formed in 1953, and the efforts to finance, design, and build the George C. Marshall Research Library soon followed. This effort required a substantial commitment from General Marshall's many friends and admirers. Our neighbors, the Virginia Military Institute and Washington and Lee University, embraced the enterprise then and continue to provide unfailing support today. The Commonwealth of Virginia conveyed the land to the Marshall Foundation. The VMI Foundation played a big role in raising money for the construction. Many prominent people were involved in this effort. We pay particular tribute to one individual, J. Clifford Miller, Jr., who was a leader of this effort, and to whose family we convey a special thank you for their support of this great event in the life of the foundation. Like me, many of you were present on May 23rd, 1964, to open the Marshall Library. It was a very, very hot day, as those of you in attendance will remember. President Lyndon Johnson, along with many other dignitaries, including President Eisenhower and General of the Army Omar Bradley, the foundation's president, were in attendance. As a VMI cadet, a third-classman, I was among many who were assigned to do specific duties on that scorching afternoon, wearing a full-dress VMI coatee made of wool. I was an escort for Mildred Bliss. Mrs. Bliss was the widow of Ambassador Robert Woods Bliss, and I was to be her escort. I honestly don't remember a whole lot about the escorting, but I do remember at the end of it all, I ended up in the halls of the library. And I was thinking, I'm sure at the time, about everything other than General Marshall, but mostly about being in an air-conditioned building. VMI had very few, if any, in those days. And I remember I was standing there when President Johnson was collecting his remarks, about to go out to the podium to address all the assembled, and again was thinking of probably 2 weeks more, I'll be summer, get out of school, beach, girls, those kinds of things, a job maybe. But the one thing I never could have imagined, of course, was that 50 years later I would be celebrating the 50th anniversary of that foundation and library. So I count myself very lucky. You never know what's going to happen in life. It was a hot day, yet it was a fitting and dignified occasion. Today we celebrate the founders' foresight and effort in seeing the library built in such a magnificent style and timeless construction. And just as impressive, it was done with very little debt, soon repaid, and we remain debt-free today. Sadly, General Marshall did not live to see the fruits of this effort or the ensuing 50 years of service this foundation has rendered to his memory. In many ways, those early days seem so long ago. The Marshall Library has become more than a national physical treasure. Today it serves as a digital portal to the world, making our incredible collections available to students and scholars in ways never imagined in 1964. Interactive, web-based offerings will help students, teachers, and scholars of all ages across the globe. No longer isolated in Lexington, Virginia, the Marshall Foundation extends Marshall's legacy through its education programs and outreach nationally and internationally. His leadership, selfless service, and approach to solving problems of global significance are as relevant today as they were in his times. I can assure you the Foundation is confident that those in the audience who return 50 years from now will look back and conclude the Foundation's uninterrupted history of excellence has been continued with even greater success than we have enjoyed in our first 50 years. This day also represents the beginning of a new era for the Marshall Foundation. That is so true in many ways. We have just about completed the original work of the Foundation. Marshall's biography in 4 volumes has been published, and the 7th and final volume of the annotated papers of George Catlett Marshall will be published next year. To help us step into that future, we have happily engaged Dr. Rob Havers, our new president. Rob is a scholar and published author, a military historian and university lecturer, and equally important, the former executive director of an organization similar to our own, the National Churchill Museum, located in Fulton, Missouri. Even though Dr. Havers assumed the presidency of the Marshall Foundation less than 3 weeks ago, he has already been pressed into service on short notice, and we shall see how he responds with clarity and a vision of the future of the Marshall-like, in a Marshall-like fashion. Before I turn the podium over to him, I ask each of you to commit your support to an exciting future for the Marshall Foundation as we continue to improve this national treasure we are responsible for maintaining and enriching. Now, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Rob Havers.
Chairman Adams, thank you. Honored guests, General P., Congressman Goodlatte, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for being here today to mark this historic moment. It is a great pleasure, a great privilege to stand here as the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation. My responsibilities, and indeed the responsibilities of the foundation, are weighty indeed. Today we commemorate the anniversary of the opening of the magnificent Marshall Research Library and Museum, an occasion that marks 50 years in Lexington, Virginia, and more than a decade before that in Washington, D.C. Service to the memory, to the legacy of General George Catlett Marshall. Jay Adams has well described the place in the world that General Marshall's reputation occupied when this fine institution was dedicated. The esteem that Marshall commanded around the world, across this nation and across the political aisle. There can be few men indeed, I think, in the history of this great nation who command such respect. Far fewer still who do it without the office of president to bolster their memory. But in the same moment that we look back to that day in 1964, as we recall all those vivid memories and consider all that has been achieved across those 50 years, we, of course, must look forward also. Jay Adams made mention of the fact that previously I had helmed the Winston Churchill Memorial and Library, now America's National Churchill Museum, an institution that, much like this, seeks to remember the past, to preserve the past, but to do so with a weather eye on the future. To do so in the certainty of belief that an understanding of the past helps explain where we are today and in turn helps chart the course for tomorrow. This is most certainly true in terms of an appreciation of the life and times of General Marshall. If the 20th century was America's century, and it surely was, then surely the man of that century was General George C. Marshall. Winston Churchill and General Marshall were great contemporaries, their affection mutual. Winston Churchill's comment in a letter written to John Hagan, then the president of the Marshall Research Foundation in 1958, summed up the purpose and the import of this institution. Churchill said at the end of that letter, "Succeeding generations must not be allowed to forget his achievements, his example." The closeness of their relationship, however, belied the fact that Churchill and Marshall were two very different men. Churchill famously, perhaps apocryphally, once remarked that history shall be kind to me, for I intend to write that history. He did write that history, and it was kind to him. But for a man like George C. Marshall, that kind of impudence, that kind of cheek, was anathema. But what Marshall would not do for himself, the George C. Marshall Foundation is now on the cusp of doing. In April of 2015, less than a year away, the final volume of the Marshall Papers will be complete. With the completion of that project, the permanency of the record of Marshall will be assured. We will continue to be the guardian, the repository of that record, the facilitator, the enabler of its interpretation. And the fact that the requests to our archives in person and virtually grows every year is testimony to the enduring fascination that Marshall, his life and times, holds for scholars and historians around the globe. We, however, as an institution, must build further, take on a more dynamic role, to ensure not only that Marshall's record remains, but that the knowledge and understanding of that record grows with each passing year, does not diminish. Excuse me. And we must do that because if ever there was a need for the self-effacing courage and integrity of a man like George C. Marshall, it is surely now in the 21st century, when his qualities, perhaps once taken for granted, are seemingly rare indeed. You need no reminding, of course, that today is the 5th of June, the anniversary of Marshall's famous speech at Harvard University, where by word and later by deed, Marshall recast himself from soldier to statesman. The organizer of victory in wartime became the organizer of victory in peace. Few indeed are those with the skills to succeed in those most disparate areas. The 5th of June, of course, is auspicious for other reasons. It is the original date of the commencement of Operation Overlord, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Now, of course, it is the anniversary of the eve of the actual invasion, 70 years ago tomorrow. We all know that General Marshall, had he been a different kind of man, then it may have been him delivering that invocation to embark upon the Great Crusade. The fact that it was not, however, yet that his reputation amongst those who know him still stands as it does, tells you and us everything in essence about who George C. Marshall is. So as we look beyond the publication of his papers, our task, our Great Crusade, is clear. Bring General Marshall more fully, more completely from the shadows of history to its center stage. To motivate young Americans today by Marshall's story, by his actions, by his very character. To cast an eye over Marshall's list of achievements as a soldier is to be impressed, not just by the list of achievements, but by the impact of those achievements. To then cast an eye over his achievements as a statesman is to be in one moment overwhelmed, yet inspired. When I first came to this country, and those of you in the audience with a keen ear will know that I'm not from Virginia. A friend of mine asked me about the decision to move from academia to leading an institution dedicated to a historical figure. The answer I gave then is true today. In this country, Americans honor their heroes, are willing to be inspired by men and women who, though they lived long ago, speak still to us today. It is the solemn duty of the George C. Marshall Foundation to ensure that Americans have the chance to know George C. Marshall, to bring his achievements to life in perpetuity. Because that story must be told to new generations. General Marshall himself said that it is hard to believe that a man familiar with the history of the centuries could fail to guide his course somewhat by the lessons of the past. He was right when he said that. He's right today. He will be right tomorrow. So for us, with one eye on what has been, we look forward to what will be. If General Marshall is no longer the household name he once was, now with new technology and new ideas, we can take his example far and wide. And so with that, I thank you for your support in the past, for your support and your presence here today, and know that as we work to bring Marshall to life for millions more Americans, we can count on your support in the future. And now, please, ladies and gentlemen, will you join Chairman Adams and I at the Marshall Foundation for a reception in our building? And please make sure you visit the special exhibition in the lower level that charts the construction and the planning of that magnificent building. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a wonderful day for the Marshall Foundation, for the memory of George C. Marshall. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. Please join us.